Hello and welcome to this lecture on digestion. Let's start with a quick overview of what the digestive canal looks like, or the digestive tract, or the alimentary canal. Those are all synonyms, all different ways to talk about the digestive system. So we're going to look at various organs in this lecture and in the following lecture. That's a quick overview of this information. So we start with the mouth. And you'll see in the mouth we also have, of course, our teeth and our tongue, which help move food around as we chew. We also have salivary glands, which do secrete some enzymes into the mouth to begin a little bit of chemical digestion. From the mouth, food will pass through the esophagus, and there is this epiglottis, which is a little flap that will block the pharynx, kind of our windpipe going into the lungs. When we swallow. So when we swallow, the epiglottis blocks the pharynx so that we swallow food down the esophagus. From the esophagus, food will travel into the stomach. From the stomach, food will travel into the small intestines. And from the small intestines, food will travel into the large intestine, which wraps around the small intestine. And then eventually, any waste material will pass out the rectum and the anus. You'll notice also a couple other organs that I didn't mention, the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas. These we call accessory organs. We call them, they're accessory because food does not pass directly through them in the process of digestion. However, these three organs are really critical in that they produce either hormones or enzymes that then act in the processes of digestion, primarily in the stomach and the small intestine. So kind of going through that slide again, the GI tract, all of that we just went through from the mouth to the rectum is about 30 feet in length. So we have all of those organs, all that tissue stored inside of our bodies, and you'll recall there were a lot of folds, especially in the small intestine, and that's how we have all that 30 feet of space folded up and tucked up in our lower abdomen. Some people liken our digestive tract to a donut. So kind of we are the donut, and the hollowed out space in the middle of the donut is our digestive tract. So it's really just one long tube that's basically passing through the center of our bodies. Again, you'll see the organs of the digestive tract and the accessory organs in red. And yep, everything we kind of just talked about on the previous slide. So let's go through each organ one by one and kind of talk about what type of digestion is happening there. So in the mouth, we have a combination of mechanical and chemical digestion, and we'll actually see in pretty much every organ we have mechanical and chemical digestion. In the mouth, the mechanical digestion is fairly obvious. We have teeth, we chew, we have a tongue. The tongue helps move the food around to different teeth so that it gets chewed. Again, we have the salivary glands, and the salivary glands produce more than just saliva, or I should say, they produce saliva which contains water, mucus, bicarbonate, antibodies, enzymes, and chief among those enzymes is salivary amylase. There is also a salivary lipase. So amylase being for sugars and lipase being for fats. So very beginning phases of digestion happening in the mouth, and primarily mechanical digestion. Also in the mouth we have taste and olfactory receptors, so that's how we sort of enjoy our food literally is by smelling it and tasting it, as well as chewing it. Then there's your diagram of the mouth. Take some time to review that if you like. And then from the mouth through the esophagus, not really any digestion happening here, but just a couple terms to go over. So when we do swallow food, which in this diagram is this gross neon green color. I mean, it's a great color, but not for food representation. So the food, as we chew it, we actually apply the term bolus to this chewed up, mushed up, slightly enzymatically digested food in the mouth. And then we swallow the bolus, and the bolus will move down the esophagus. And so you'll see on the rightmost diagram, you'll see that epiglottis flap covering the larynx right here, so that we make sure the food goes down the esophagus and not down the larynx. Peristalsis is the sequential circular contractions of the rings of the esophagus, and this diagram is actually kind of poor for that regard. We actually kind of see in the larynx how it's kind of ringed. The esophagus is lined by like ringed muscles, and they contract sequentially, moving from top to bottom. And that peristalsis, that sequential muscular contraction, is actually what moves the bolus down the esophagus and into the stomach. And then the esophageal sphincter will lay at the base of the esophagus, where it attaches to the stomach, and the purpose of that is to keep food in the stomach and not coming back up the esophagus. And especially we'll see when we get to the stomach, hydrochloric acid is produced there. We definitely don't want hydrochloric acid coming back up our esophagus. That would burn. So if you have ever had, if you've ever thrown up, or if you've ever eaten so much that you're having a little bit of reflux, or if you're eating something that's giving you acid reflux, that is literally acid, the hydrochloric acid from your stomach, in most cases, not every, but it is typically the hydrochloric acid, once food has hit the stomach, coming back up into the esophagus, and that's essentially what reflux is in most cases. Okay, so here's our stomach. So you'll see the esophagus coming into the stomach and the lower esophageal sphincter, or I just called it esophageal sphincter on the last page. The stomach is a really cool organ, I think. The maximum capacity of the organ, so then again, this will vary slightly person to person, but on average, the stomach, if it's packed full, can hold a gallon of food. And it is a malleable organ, so if you continue to eat more and more and more, you can actually start to stretch the stomach a little bit. When the stomach is totally empty, its capacity is only about 3/4 of a cup. So really pretty fascinating, the extent to which the volume of the stomach can change. Let's look at a little bit of the structure. So you'll notice these words fundus and rugae, so the gastric folds inside the body of the stomach. So this is really important because similar to peristalsis in the esophagus, the stomach does churn. Technically, these are muscles. The stomach is a muscle, and so these will contract to move food around in the stomach. This diagram doesn't quite show it, but there's a surface lining. We could say that it's this white lining of mucus cells, and these cells will secrete a mucus to help protect the stomach, the lining and the outside and the membrane of the stomach from the hydrochloric acid, which is secreted to aid in digestion of food in the stomach. So in addition to the mucus cells in the stomach, we also have two primary cell groups. We have G cells and three G cells, parietal cells, and chief cells. So the G cells produce gastrin, which is a hormone, and this hormone is basically the first step of digestion in the stomach. So G cells produce gastrin, and gastrin stimulates the parietal and the chief cells. The parietal cells then are the ones that actually release hydrochloric acid. And hydrochloric acid, the function is to denature proteins, and denature is the term we use to talk about the unfolding of that quaternary protein structure. Hydrochloric acid will also kill unwanted bacteria, so it's one of our lines of defense when we're talking about the immune system, is this ability, if pathogens come into the body via food, theoretically, the hydrochloric acid production by the parietal cells is enough to actually kill those bacteria. And then intrinsic factor, which is abbreviated IF, also produced by the parietal cells and really key in absorbing the vitamin B12. Chief cells produce, we call it a proenzyme, which is an inactive enzyme called pepsinogen. And the hydrochloric acid production from the parietal cells will actually activate pepsinogen into the enzyme pepsin. And pepsin, kind of doing this word association again, so peptide, pepsin. Peptide is amino acid chain, is a protein. Pepsin digests proteins. And then gastric lipase is also produced by the chief cells. And lipase, lipid, lipase, so lipid digestion. Anything ending in an ACE is typically going to be an enzyme. And for the purpose of our class, or at least for this lecture, when we're talking about enzymes, so anything ending in an ACE, it's a digestive enzyme. And then you can usually look at the first half of the word to determine what it's digesting. In the stomach, we do see a little bit of absorption. Primarily, we see water absorption, alcohol absorption, and then some lipid-soluble drugs and also vitamins, and then some short-chain fatty acids, so really short chain, and some minerals. But really, the stomach is not, we don't consider it a major site of absorption, but you understand that some things, if they're small enough, will be absorbed from the stomach and delivered into the bloodstream. So here I'm going to insert the accessory organs, the pancreas, the gallbladder, and the liver, because from the stomach, food will pass to the small intestine, and really it's in the small intestine that these accessory organs, that their secretions act on the small intestine. So I'm sort of inserting this here. I think I might have skipped over this word chyme in the previous slide, but chyme, so similar to how we talk about the bolus in the mouth and passing down the esophagus, and the food that's chewed and started to be chemically digested. Chyme is the term given to the contents of the stomach, the digestive contents. So proteins as they're starting to be denatured, some carbohydrates as they're starting to break down a little bit. And the food really becomes liquidy here because it's really starting to get broken down into its elemental chemical parts so that we can absorb those and use them in the body. So let's go through each accessory organ, starting with the pancreas. So the couple primary functions of the pancreas, and you'll see the pancreas is this beautiful yellow structure over here. So the pancreas does make certain digestive enzymes that will be secreted into the small intestine. The pancreas also produces insulin and glucagon, which are the key hormones for regulating blood glucose. And the pancreas also produces bicarbonate, which is super crucial because, again, as food is coming from that stomach into the small intestine, it's very acidic because of the hydrochloric acid. The small intestine does not have the same protective lining that the stomach does with those mucosal cells. The small intestine does have mucosal cells, but they don't secrete such a mucus to protect from the acidity. So instead, the pancreas secretes bicarbonate into the small intestine to neutralize the acidity of the chyme. So bringing the pH back up towards neutral. So those are the three key functions of the pancreas in digestion. And then the gallbladder, I could put this third, but you'll see on the next slide, the liver produces bile, and the gallbladder, tucked right up under the liver, stores the bile. And bile is that it does contain some phospholipids, which aid in the emulsification and then a subsequent sort of digestion of fatty acids. So the liver makes the bile. Liver is also the site of processing wastes and toxins. So you might remember we talked about proteins recently. If we are not using the full amino acid for a peptide, we may break the amino acid down to be used as energy or to store it as a triglyceride. But if we do one of those two latter things, we need to remove the amine portion of the amino acid and that gets converted to ammonia and then urea. And remember, ammonia is highly toxic to the human body, and that's the job of the liver to work on processing that out. And also where we would see alcohol would be delivered to the liver, and then any other sort of toxins. So especially this day and age with all sorts of sort of known toxins added to our food supply, it's the site of the liver is the site where we detoxify or literally change the chemical structure of these toxic chemicals that enter the body such that they are no longer harmful to the body. And then the liver does also receive all the end products of digestion. So our glucose, our fatty acids, our amino acids, and vitamins or minerals. And particularly with glucose and fatty acids and the amino acids, we will either send these out to the rest of the body for use or package them into storage either as glycogen or triglyceride. All right, then moving on to the small intestine, and you'll notice that the small intestine kind of has three names, or it doesn't have three names, but it's divided into three sections: the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. The uppermost portion, the middle portion, and the lower portion. You don't necessarily need to know that, but you've probably seen these words written on the previous slides, so now you know what they are. And then the ileocecal valve is going into the large intestine from the small intestine. In the small intestine, this is kind of our major site of digestion. So I'll start with the hormone activity in the small intestine. So the small intestine actually does makes these three hormones. And the small intestine is sort of triggered to make these hormones when chyme comes through that pyloric sphincter. And I didn't show this on that previous slide, but the pyloric sphincter is the sphincter connecting the stomach to the small intestine. And just kind of to review, if it wasn't clear when I said this earlier with the lower esophageal sphincter, the job of a sphincter is to allow passage of material in one direction only. So from the esophagus into the stomach, the sphincter allows food to only go in that direction. It's the job of the sphincter to keep food from moving back up into the esophagus from the stomach. And so the same thing, as food moves from the stomach into the small intestine, the pyloric sphincter should close after food passes from stomach to small intestine so that it cannot go backwards. So it can't go back up into the stomach once it reaches the small intestine. So the three hormones, cholecystokinin, secretin, and gastric inhibitory peptide. CCK acts on the gallbladder. So this is sort of generally a definition of a hormone, although it's not always the case. But most hormones are manufactured by one organ, and they're basically a messenger because then they're made by one organ, but they act on a different organ. But again, not always the case. So small intestine makes CCK, which goes and basically knocks on the door of the gallbladder and says, okay, hey, you have bile, release your bile into the small intestine for lipid emulsification. Secretin, so here's a case where secretin is made by the small intestine and actually acts on the small intestine. So secretin is the message that tells the pancreas to make and release bicarbonate to neutralize the chyme, and then gastric inhibitory peptide acts on the stomach to slow down the emptying of the contents of the stomach. GIP also acts on the small intestine, or on the pancreas, to stimulate the release of insulin. And then enzymes, so again, you'll notice these all end in ASE. Well, I've pluralized some of them, but they end in ASE. So peptidase, lipase, sucrase, maltase, and lactase. Peptidase, peptides, lipase, lipids, sucrase, sucrose. Maltase is for our complex carbohydrates, or starches, basically. So as we break starches into smaller carbohydrate chains, we use maltase to do that. Lactase acts on lactose. And then the small intestine is the major site of digestion, also the major site of absorption. So in the small intestine, we see absorption of water, minerals, our electrolytes, which are minerals, fatty acids and amino acids, and I don't know why it's not on here, but our monosaccharides. So our glucose, our fructose, and our galactose. Then from the small intestine, we still have to pass our food mass into the large intestine. And there is still some digestion that happens in the large intestine. Actually, if you're familiar with the term microbiome, we have bacteria that live all over our bodies and all inside our bodies too. So primarily in the small and large intestine, we see what we call the gut microbiome, or the gut bacteria. And in the large intestine, these bacteria actually further digest some of our food, particularly soluble fibers are digested by bacteria. And as they digest our soluble fibers, they release certain chemicals, including different types of fatty acids, that we then absorb into our bloodstream and use either for energy. We use some of the byproducts of bacterial digestion to begin building immune cells. So really quite a symbiotic relationship we have with our large intestine bacteria. Also in the large intestine, we see the formation of the stool and the bowel movements. Similar, so the small intestine also does see peristalsis, or the action of peristalsis happens in the small intestine too, but also happens in the large intestine. And it's that sort of sequential action of the ringed muscles that passes food first up the ascending colon, then across the transverse colon, then down the descending colon. So in order to move our digested matter upward against gravity, we have to have this muscular contraction to move it up, and then also to move it horizontally. Depending on what's being digested, digestive mass will sit in the large intestine for, it won't sit there, but it will move through the large intestine over the course of 12 to sometimes even 24 hours. So here's a little bit more on the gut microbiome, so the bacteria in the large intestine. We do have also some pathogenic bacteria that live down there, so it's kind of a balancing act. The more healthy bacteria we have in the large intestine, the fewer pathogenic bacteria we have. If we become really ill, or if we eat foods that the pathogenic bacteria like, which is these types of bacteria really like simple sugars, glucose and glucose and glucose. So the more simple sugar foods we eat or drink, we are basically feeding these pathogenic bacteria and then throwing the balance out of whack, unfortunately not in our favor. So understanding that they're, it's like yin and yang. It's literally just finding that balance. But fortunately, we know that the healthy bacteria really thrive on soluble fibers. So the more we include fiber in our diet, particularly soluble fibers, the more we feed these beneficial bacteria. Yep. Then last slide here, I think. In the large intestine, we do see some absorption, particularly some more water, although again, most water was absorbed in the stomach and the small intestine, a few minerals, and then also the products of bacterial fermentation or digestion would be absorbed from the large intestine. And then from the large intestine, any waste products would move out, and anything we're not using from our food, especially our insoluble fibers, would then pass out the rectum and the anus.